Perceptions of Language in Pygmalion. Today I'll be talking about Pygmalion, a famous play by Bernard Shaw. I'll be asking a question that I think is central to Pygmalion. How accurately do we perceive language? Language experts say that we often misperceive language, confusing good and bad usages. Confusion about good and bad English can be a particular problem in Pygmalion. Sometimes Eliza Doolittle's bad English turns out to be better than we expected. And Henry Higgins's good English isn't always as good as we might expect. I'll have more to say about this soon. My starting point today is Jacques Derrida's advice to pay attention to the marginal elements in a written work. That got me thinking about the marginal personages in Pygmalion. They never appear in the play, but they help shape Eliza's story. The most formidable one of all is English poet John Milton. Of course, Milton doesn't appear in Pygmalion, he's in the margins, but Henry Higgins greatly admires him. In an early version of Shaw's play, Higgins talks about writing poetry along Miltonic lines. Milton was a controversial figure. Some of his political and religious ideas were radical for his time. At one point, he even had to go into hiding. Here's a fun fact you might not know. When Milton was 34, he took a bride half his age. The marriage was a troubled one. After 3 months, she went home to her mother. They did reunite 3 years later. Perhaps because of that unhappy marriage, he became an advocate for, of all things, polygamy. If you're not getting along with your wife, Milton's solution is to bring her second or third one into your household. What could possibly go wrong? Milton explored polygamy and a number of other biblical ideas in an essay called De Doctrina Christiana, of Christian doctrine. Note the Latin title. Although Milton is regarded as one of the greatest English poets, he did most of his political and religious writing in Latin for 2 reasons. One is that many Europeans were fluent in the classical languages. Writing in Latin gave Milton access to a readership far beyond the British Isles. The second reason is that Latin was considered more precise and sophisticated than English. Latin, unlike English, is a highly inflected language, meaning lots of endings. Here are some of the endings for the verb continuo. There are 120 of them. I didn't have room to show them all here. It's easy to see why English seemed inferior to Latin. English has only a small grammatical toolbox. A typical English verb has only 4 forms. The maximum is 5 or 6 forms. A few verbs have only 3. Veneration of Latin continued into the 20th century. Henry Sweet was the model for Henry Higgins. According to Shaw, Sweet never forgave Oxford for its neglect of English studies. At Oxford, only Latin and Greek mattered. In 1944, Shaw complained, "Our school system still proceeds on the assumption that Latin is the language of literature and culture." In this picture, Shaw is on the right. Young Bernard Shaw attended schools that valued Latin and Greek and ignored English. Shaw earned a top grade for an essay he wrote in English, but prizes were given only to students who wrote in Latin. This is our first example of a misperception about language. Shaw's teachers couldn't see what a gifted writer he was. His teachers thought that English was a linguistic wasteland. But we think English back then was a linguistic Garden of Eden. English hadn't yet started to deteriorate. When Shaw was a schoolboy, pronoun case and number still mattered, whom was still taught in schools, people cared about singulars and plurals, and grammar was taken seriously. So, was 1870s English a barren wasteland, or was it a sumptuous Garden of Eden? Who's right? It's the wrong question. Linguistics experts tell us there's no such thing as a better language. All languages are capable of precision and sophistication. English is precise enough to explain how to launch rockets into outer space and bring them back. Think for a moment about supposedly primitive indigenous languages. In World Wars I and II, Native American code talkers transmitted complex military secrets in Navajo, Choctaw, and Cherokee. But shouldn't we be worried about the future of English? In 2019, novelist Lionel Shriver wrote an article for Harper's Magazine warning about the dangers that English was facing. She said, "The steady decay of English syntax is a first world problem par excellence." Shriver wants us to know that our language toolbox is shrinking. If the shrinking continues, we may lose our ability to communicate. Who's to blame for the impending death of English? One uncomfortable answer is Eliza Doolittle and others like her who speak English carelessly. We've all heard Henry's harsh words to her. A woman who utters such depressing and disgusting sounds has no right to be anywhere, no right to live. I'm going to argue that Higgins is wrong. There's no threat. Eliza's English is better than we might expect, and English isn't deteriorating. The first step I propose is to define decay. It's not just sloppy writing or careless diction. In 1819, John Keats used of instead of have in a letter he was writing. It's the same mistake college freshmen make today, and nothing to worry about. A language decays when a function or tool is lost or forgotten. It's something that rarely happens. English still has almost all of the capabilities it had in Shakespeare's time. But I do have an example of a grammatical tool that has been lost. Our singular second-person pronouns. In Act 4 of Pygmalion, Henry Higgins is talking to Eliza after the embassy reception, and he says, "Now you are free and can do what you like." In the 1600s and 1700s, sentences like Henry's infuriated teachers and grammarians. Are is plural. Higgins is talking to just one person, Eliza Doolittle. He couldn't use are. He should have said, "Thou art free and canst do what thou likest." And there's another problem. Eliza is Henry's social inferior. In Shakespeare's day, Higgins would never have addressed her with the formal you. For 200 years, frustrated grammarians predicted the demise of English if the singular you are became standard. English is dying. We have to preserve the difference between singulars and plurals. Of course, we eventually did lose those pronouns. But the dire predictions were wrong. Today we use you are for one person every day, and English still has its singulars and plurals. Nowadays, English seems to be facing a new danger, the singular they. Here's an example. Someone left their jacket in the cafeteria. The Modern Language Association recently accepted the singular they, a decision that seems to signal yet another step towards the death of English. Once again, grammarians are sounding a warning. But the singular they goes all the way back to 1375. You'll find it in Chaucer, Caxton, Austen, Shakespeare, Dickens, Thackeray, and many other classic writers, including Bernard Shaw. Here's a snippet from Mrs. Higgins's At Home in Act 3 of Pygmalion. Mrs. Eynsford Hill says, "What does doing her in mean?" And Higgins quickly says, "Oh, that's the new small talk. To do a person in means to kill them." It's another instance of misperceiving language. Because we don't expect a stickler like Higgins to use a singular they, we don't hear it. Most of Lionel Shriver's decay examples concern usage issues rather than grammatical tools. In other words, they're parts of English that can change. For example, she complains that many people say quicker rather than more quickly. But that's not a loss of function. By the way, I've published a rebuttal to Schreiber's article in the online Writers Guild magazine. You'll find a link under this video. Schreiber says that people who don't value whom are animals. But Shaw says whom has nothing to do with grammar. It's a pronunciation aid. And why do we need whom anyway? We don't have subjective and objective cases. For what? If you talk to a linguistic specialist, you'll discover that English has supposedly been deteriorating since the Norman Conquest, when Old English lost most of its grammatical infrastructure and became Middle English. But the truth is that some of that lost infrastructure wasn't lost at all. It was replaced by new tools that Latin didn't have. English has elaborate rules about word order, for example. We learn them as children, and they don't appear in most grammar books. I believe that English today has the same capabilities it had when I was in high school. In fact, I think I'm a better writer than I was back then. That would be impossible if English were decaying. English is still there, for me, as strong as ever. But what about someone who has never mastered basic grammar? Eliza speaks curbstone English. Is she able to form and express sophisticated ideas? Many Shaw critics say no. Human development requires language development. It seems logical, right? Here are three critics who think that Eliza's language instruction turned her into a fully developed human being. We have Errol Durbach, Eric Bentley, and Charles Burst. If we look at Eliza's grammar problems, we can easily see the difficulty. Eliza doesn't seem to have the grammatical tools needed for sophisticated sentences. But I'm going to argue that Eliza can think conceptually, and sometimes she uses surprisingly sophisticated grammar. Once again, we may be misperceiving what's really there. Here's Eliza early in Act 1, selling flowers at Covent Garden. Freddie just ran into her and spilled her violets. Eliza chides Freddie's mother. Well, if you'd done your duty by him as a mother should, he'd know better than to spoil a poor girl's flowers and then run away without paying. I'm not even going to attempt a Cockney pronunciation. But the words are exactly what Eliza says. This is a counterfactual conditional sentence with two subjunctive verbs. And there's more. A comparative adverbial clause. Two readability formulas scored this sentence at the 11th grade level. Despite what some critics think, Eliza is quite capable of both thinking rationally and constructing sophisticated sentences. Meanwhile, Henry Higgins is sitting nearby, listening carefully to Eliza and writing down every word she utters. But he doesn't really hear Eliza or who she is. Later, in Act 3, Higgins tells his mother that Eliza had to learn a complete new language. She talks English almost as you talk French. But if you picture an ESL student trying to use conditionals and subjunctives, you'll see that Henry has never made a serious effort to listen to Eliza. Eliza's life experience confirms that she can form and express complex sentences. Although she's still in her teens, she's a self-supporting entrepreneur. She knows the laws governing her business. I've a right to sell flowers if I stay off the curb. She can defend herself. And she's made enough money to move from Lisson Grove to Drury Lane. When Higgins fills Eliza's basket with coins, she makes a sensible plan to use the money. Henry hears all this, just as we in the audience do, but he can't break through his disdainful assumptions about her. She's barely human. Here, by contrast, is a wise observation from Mina Shaughnessy, a pioneer in open access college education. Her book is about the Elizas of today, underprepared students facing the future with a mixture of hope and fear. She says, Neglected by the dominant society, they have nonetheless had their own worlds to grow up in. They arrive on our campuses as young adults with opinions and languages and plans already in their minds. Of course, we want those students, and Eliza herself, to master standard English, just as we want them to learn table manners and other life skills. You'll remember that when the young Shaw was learning how to be a great man, he studied an etiquette book. I think Eliza's story challenges us to make a choice. We can read Pygmalion as a warning about the threats that English faces today. Or, my suggestion, we can find reasons to be confident about our wonderful language. English will survive, and so will Eliza Doolittle and others like her if we respect their fundamental humanity.